Okay. Yeah. Welcome to our discussion. The discussion tonight is the origins of public Torah reading. So, sometimes I like to have sort of a general sense of what your impression is about public reading of scripture. I'm pretty sure, I'm certainly not a scholar of other religious traditions, but I don't know that there was public reading of scripture before Judaism. Certainly in Christianity, and of course, I always preface my mention of Christianity by the fact that there are 43,000 or so different Christian movements, and they're all very different. Well, there's a wide range of differences among the movements, but certainly in the Catholic Church, and maybe some of you also can mention other Christian traditions with which you are familiar. In the Catholic Church, I think at every Mass, maybe Jim, you can correct me on this, there is both a reading from the Old Testament, and I think there's also a reading from the Gospels.
There's three readings. Generally speaking, the first is the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
The second is the see, you didn't catch me.
Yes, good.
The second is from one of the letters or the epistles of St. Paul or somebody like that, and the third is the Gospel. But sometimes the first one will be from the New Testament during a certain period or something.
So, Jerry Kirschman.
Yeah, and I guess it depends kind of what you mean by a public reading of, a religious document, right? Because
I would say of scripture.
Yeah, well, then that of course is different. But if you look at, like, say, just in terms of religious traditions, the Egyptians did things like that, where they had a lot of ceremonies. They had a lot of call them festivals or whatever you like. A lot of it had to do with dedications of different gods along the Nile, etc., for example. So they would do public readings that were probably politically motivated.
Yeah, I think we're going to see, I don't recall this article discussing that, but I think we're going to see some hints of that. Alan.
Yeah. Well, if I may, sorry,
go ahead. So go ahead. Yeah.
One more point. Sorry. So they weren't the only ones, right? So, Egypt is just a great example because I always say it was the New York City of its time, influential in the region. But there were other places that did that too. And we have documents coming down to us from, archaeological things and everything like that show that they did that. But then I want to put it in some context. These were very often politically motivated things. The pronouncements, if you will. So,
yeah. Okay. Thank you, Alan.
Is there a connection between these scripture readings or Torah readings, which happened, I thought, from what I'm led to believe, on Mondays and Thursdays or something, or in the square someplace? Is there a connection between those readings and the difference between oral law and when it became written law?
Yeah, so the article that we're going to read traces back the origin of these readings that are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. So this would be written law. And it's a very good question. I don't recall whether the article gets into it as to what differences or what traditions were added in oral law. You mentioned the I'm trying to think of that noisy. I got it. You mentioned that that the readings are in Judaism to this day. We read Torah on Shabbat, on holidays, and on Mondays and Thursdays. And the understanding of Mondays and Thursdays is that they were market days. And so when people were coming from the hinterlands into towns, while they were in towns, that was determined to be a good time to read Torah. On Shabbat, you read the entire Torah portion. So the Torah is actually divided into 54 Torah portions, because when you have, I love watching Jim when I mentioned one of these things, because your reaction is very visible. I don't know how many you can see it, but Jim was a look of puzzlement. So there are 54 Torah portions because 9 times in a 17-year cycle. No, I think it's 7 times in a 19-year cycle. There's an entire extra month added to the Hebrew calendar, which is the way we keep the Hebrew, the lunar calendar and the solar calendar coordinated. So if you have a year in which there is a leap month, you have, roughly speaking, 4 extra Shabbatot. So you need to have 4 extra Torah readings. So what do you do in a year in which we don't have a extra Torah reading? You have double portions. So it'll be traditional in a synagogue that you'll actually read 2 Torah portions, and they're not all necessarily equal in length. And I actually just plain don't know who was it that decided where the portions begin and portions end. That would be a very interesting question, but I don't know the answer. And on Shabbat, typically you read the entire Torah portion. So in a traditional synagogue, you would have someone called a Baal Kriya, literally the master of the sounding or the reading, and it'll take, even going pretty quickly, it might take 20 or 25 minutes of reading and chanting. And on Mondays and Thursdays, and actually on Shabbat afternoon, where there's also a traditional reading, and also on holidays, you don't read quite as large a portion. And then on Shabbat and on holidays, you also read a section from the prophets called the Haftarah, which is not read on Mondays and Thursdays. And the other thing which I find personally interesting is that in Islam, the entire service in a Muslim, in a mosque, everything that is done during the service is from the Quran. But actually, I have no idea, and I really feel like I should know this, but I don't know if there is a cycle of readings. I mean, all the prayers and the statements are from the Quran. So the Quran is far more central to Islam than Bible is to Judaism and Christianity from a liturgical point of view. But I don't know if they go through the Quran and read it section by section. Erwin.
I think there, I read somewhere like Kiryat Torah is coming from Ezra the scribe.
Yes, and we're going to see that. Yes.
Okay, so that's where the reading of the Torah comes from.
Yeah, but not only
Monday to Thursday. After
yes.
Babylon. After Babylon.
Yes, and yes, Ezra and Nehemiah are those that return from Babylon. So that's actually going to be a major element to discuss. Okay, good. Okay, and I would say, I'll put it this way: I have never been in a Reform synagogue on a Shabbat where the entire Torah portion of the week was read. I think in the conservatives, actually, I don't know what happens in many conservative synagogues. I just plain don't know. I have been in conservative synagogues where they read the entire Torah portion. And I'm sure in traditional synagogues, in traditional synagogues, people read the entire, or the entire Torah portion is read. There's also, I'll just mention one other element, which is kind of interesting, and I don't know where this tradition stands in different communities. There's something called the triennial cycle. So in an effort to reduce the amount of Torah that's being read, because unless you really understand it, it can be boring and difficult for the reader and boring for the listeners. So there came a tradition where, let's say it was the first Torah portion of the year, Breshit, you'd only read a third of it. And then in the second year of a 3-year cycle, you read the second third of each Torah portion. And in the third year of the cycle, you read the third. So there are a bunch of traditions like that. Alan.
You just said mostly what I was going to say, which is the conservative movement a number of decades ago developed this I don't know if they created it, but they applied the
Oh, okay.
triennial and also the part of your statement, which I have a little knowledge, is that conservative synagogues often they either do the entire Torah portion or do the triennial. So
Okay.
they can vary based on, you know, culture of the synagogue or customs, I guess, better word,
Yeah.
and so forth. But I don't know if triennial applies any place in the conservative movement. That's all.
Yeah. And my own practice when I was on the pulpit was to if there was a bar mitzvah where we would have a Saturday morning service, we would read really just there is a tradition, I don't know where this one comes from. You have to read at least 3 verses for an aliyah. If someone's called up to Torah, 3 verses are the minimum. So basically in a traditional Saturday morning service, there are 7 aliyahs, 7 different people or groups come up to bless the Torah, and either they read from the Torah or the reader reads from the Torah. So that's 21 verses. And then the bar mitzvah boy or bat mitzvah girl reads what is called the maftir, which are the last verses in the Torah portion, and that can be 3 to 5 verses. So it's an attempt to basically not make a service drag on for hours and hours. Okay, so I think we will jump into the discussion of the article. I trust you can see the article. Okay, thank you. So this is from Torah.com, Historic Hachel Ceremonies and the Origin of Public Torah Reading. And I'll read a little bit of the introduction. Deuteronomy's command to publicly read the Torah on Sukkot every 7 years appears in stories about King Josiah, King Agrippa, and Ezra the scribe. The latter's innovative ceremony serves as the model for what became synagogue Torah reading, as Erwin pointed out. And here's an image of Ezra on a wooden tower near the Watergate reading the laws of Moses. Okay, so maybe I'll just read this one. In Deuteronomy 31, Moses charges the people to perform a public reading of the Torah. So it says, at the end of every 7th year, the year set for remission at the Feast of Booths, so that's Chag HaSukkot, and at the end of every 7 years in the Torah, debts are remitted. So that's what they mean, the year set for remission. When all Israel comes to appear before Adonai, your God, in the place that he will choose. So again, in Deuteronomy, we have this phrase, in the place that he will choose, b'makom asher yivchar, which is understood always to be the temple in Jerusalem. You shall read this teaching aloud in the presence of all Israel. So again, in Hebrew, tikra et haTorah hazot. So the word Torah here is translated into teaching. Okay, so that's actually what I guess the next comment is. Scholars generally understand the word Torah here as a reference to Deuteronomy and not the entire Pentateuch, the 5 books. The Mishnah further limits the scope, claiming that the reading is from selected parts of Deuteronomy only. So here's a little bit of, I'm sorry, I'm getting noise in the background. And I can't quite see where it's coming from. So here is a discussion in the Mishnah, and he reads from the beginning of Deuteronomy until the Shema. The Shema is 6, then he reads the Shema, 6:4 to 9, and then he reads the second paragraph of the Shema, V'haya im Shemoah, which means if you will listen, and then you will surely tithe when you complete your tithe, and then the blessings and curses until the entire passage is complete. So to address, some of the discussion that some of you raised. So we have this phrase in the Torah, which is you will read this teaching aloud, which uses the word Torah, and then the Mishnah, oral law, is narrowing down the range of what actually gets read. Okay, would someone like to pick up a general audience?
Having
Hold on a
estab-
second, Erwin, you have your hand up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have two questions to ask. When did the decision came in that the gabbai has to be there to read the Torah? And the other thing, why did they instituted after reading the Torah to do the Hagbah?
Okay, I don't know about the Chagba. The Gabbai is really someone who is checking to make sure the
Yeah.
reader doesn't make a mistake. And again, I think that just be sort of a natural thing to do. But the answer,
the Midrash says that if somebody makes a mistake, they have to start all over again.
yeah, there's all kinds of rules. I don't know if that's midrash or halacha. I guess they can be midrash halacha. I actually have somewhere in my bookshelf a Gabai's manual which addresses things like that. And in the world of synagogue readings, when rabbis are reading, and there's other rabbis reading, there's somebody there checking, and if we make a mistake, someone will correct it. And I always struggle a little bit with the question of not wanting to embarrass the reader. So if the person is really stuck and literally stopped, I will help the person reading. If they make a slight mistake in pronunciation of a word, theoretically, I'm supposed to correct them on that. In practice, for me, the value of not wanting to upset or offend someone is greater than the significance of pronouncing the word correctly. But that's the role of the Gabbai. And it's actually very helpful to have a Gabbai.
Unfortunately, I was present several bar mitzvahs where the parents forced a child who was mentally not capable of doing and I think the child was suffering more than it was necessary. So I sometimes I don't think it is justified to do that to a child.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I would say, that for me is the hallmark of Reform Judaism, which would say ethical rules, how we treat one another, are far more important than ritual rules, which is to say, do we insist upon reading the Torah portion perfectly? So I've actually, in my career as a pulpit rabbi, I've had some bar and bat mitzvahs students who really, because of learning disabilities and other problems, were really not capable of reading from a Torah scroll. So again, depending on their abilities, I might have a little cheat sheet sitting on top of the Torah scroll, which might be transliterated to help, English characters to help them. Or what I have also done on a couple of occasions is either purposely schedule their bar bat mitzvah for when the Shema and the V'ahavta are read, because the students, if they go, and if it's a very common prayer for those of you who don't know what I mean by that, and so the students generally know that, so they're able to do that, without even having a text in front of them. And then I have also been known to actually just have them read that portion of Torah, whether or not it's the appropriate Torah reading at the time to be read. Because to me, the most important element of the bar and bat mitzvah service is that, the child feels like he or she has a good experience, and that the synagogue embraces them. I have vivid memories of staying up all night before my bar mitzvah, throwing up because I was so terrified of the experience. My bar mitzvah, well, the proof of the pudding in my own bar mitzvah is I didn't go into a synagogue for 20 years after that. Alan, you're muted. You're muted, Alan.
Yeah, sorry. going back one step, not the one of your bar mitzvah, the one of the good experience for the child. I wanted to share that in another world that I can't get into, but had to do a business I was in helping bar mitzvah students learn, focusing on conservative reform. I was asked by an Orthodox rabbi to help with this student. And because of the lack of a background, it wasn't necessarily a disability. It was a Russian family who had only moved here recently, so wasn't able to handle a long Torah portion. And what I learned from Rabbi Lipner was his goal as an Orthodox rabbi is to give the bar mitzvah student a good Jewish experience. And so although you might not have thought that of an Orthodox rabbi, and maybe some Orthodox rabbis would not, it's the same thing that I have heard from conservative and reform rabbis. You make adjustments based on various reasons, and hopefully you don't make them sick to your stomach the night before, like your experience.
Right. And I would say one of the differences is that in a traditional synagogue, the child is not reading the whole Torah portion anyway. Traditionally, the bar bat mitzvah in a traditional synagogue, the bar bat mitzvah student is only reading what is called the maftir. The maftir comes from the word for completion, which is typically the last 3 to 5 verses. And the reason is because it's difficult. They will read the entire haftarah because you're allowed to read the haftarah from a book that has the vowels and the trope. So if you know how to read Hebrew with vowels and you know the musical values of trope, it's much easier to read from a book than to read from a Torah scroll, which has no vowels, no musical notations, and no punctuation at all, which really you wind up memorizing. Yeah, and that's actually my understanding is that's the reason why the bar mitzvah only reads the maftir, the last portion. I know this is getting pretty technical and confusing. So let's go on. Someone want to pick up on general audience.
Having established the basic contours of the mitzvah, Deuteronomy expands on the details of who should be present and why.
Okay.
Gather the people.
So
men-
first, let's just go and read the headings too. Who
Oh,
should be
who-
present?
Okay. Who? Men, women, children, sojourners. Gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities. So why? So they learn to revere God and observe Torah, that they may hear and so learn to revere Yahweh, your God, and to observe faithfully every word of this teaching. The opening word of this verse, hakel, gather, from the root, meaning congregation or gathering, gives the commandment its name and reflects its outlook nicely.
Yeah, so let me just point out here at the beginning of this discussion, it says gather the people. It's hachel heta'am. So the word is hachel, and if you get rid of the initial hey, which puts it in sort of in the command form. The root is kuf hey lamed, which is the root kuf hey lamed, which we often hear as the word kahal. Congregations are often called a kahal, and you will hear actually the congregation in Ojai is called Kehilat Ha'alonim, the congregation of the oaks. So that's I wouldn't say a terribly common name for a synagogue, but you will hear that often, Kehilat, from the word kahal. Alan, you unmute and chime in. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't
No
know the
problem.
word. Sorry.
Okay. So let's pick up Jerry right here. This reading was not.
This reading was not for priests, scribes, or other initiated literary.
Literati.
I can't, there's another T?
There's a T at the
There
end.
is.
Literati.
Okay, literati alone. as we have expected in antiquity, but rather for the widest possible audience without regard to status, gender, or age. This fits with the public nature of the theophany at Horeb, which forms the basis of God's covenant with Israel.
Yeah,
Does
so
that-
so it's an interesting element just to observe that the reading of Torah is meant for everyone. One of the things, and again, different Christian movements vary greatly, but in many Christian communities over the centuries, the average person did not own or read a Bible. Basically, you would talk to your priest and your priest would tell you what to do. But the idea of Bible study was really restricted to the scholars. In Judaism, everyone, and for this time, meaning every male, needed to be literate, which, it had a profound influence on Judaism. I can't remember the age, but I think like at age 3, the child was expected to start being able to read Torah, and by age 6 or 7, Mishnah, and then move on to other sacred scripture. So universal literacy, again, this is a male-dominated world, so they're really talking about men only. But universal literacy was part of Judaism, still is part of Judaism, and the idea is that the reading is for everyone, not simply for the literati or the scholars. Jerry.
So speaking of which, should we put the little context around when you say around this time? Maybe do you want to add to that?
So when I'm thinking about, I'm really thinking about what's written in the Mishnah about when children are responsible for what and what age. And so the Mishnah is written down in the year 200 Common Era. That's actually where we get the concept of bar and bat mitzvah. So that's the time frame that I'm thinking of.
Okay. All right.
And then, of course, one of the great revolutions of the Protestant Reformation is as a response to what I just described as a Christian tradition where only the scholars have access to holy books. With the invention of the printing press, everyone could have a Bible. And so they're developed a concept called, which is often called sola scriptura in Latin, which means just give me the scripture. Don't, Mr. Priest, interpret scripture for me and just tell me what to do, but give me scripture itself. And so then you have the beginning of a very radical idea, and that is translating scripture into common language. Up until the Reformation, the only in the Christian world, you had scripture in Greek and Latin, but not in the languages that people were speaking in German and English. And my understanding is that it was a capital crime to translate the Bible into other languages. And of course, the Protestant Reformation was enormous and had an enormous influence. And basically with the idea that everyone should be able to read and own and interpret scripture for themselves. Erwin.
I would like to ask you, why did Maimonides made that exception that you don't need a minya to read the Torah, the final 8 verses?
I don't know that.
Where does it come from?
I don't know that tradition, and nor do I know the reason. So I can't intelligently comment on it. And what Erwin is referring to is that to have a formal prayer service, you need a quorum, which is often called a minyan, which is always called a minyan. I wouldn't say it's often called a minyan. It's always called a minyan. And a minyan is 10 Jews who are obligated to pray. So in the Orthodox world, it would be 10 adult men. And by adult, we mean men over 13. It doesn't matter whether they've actually celebrated a bar bat mitzvah, a bar mitzvah. Once you're over 13, you're counted in the minyan. And I would say more egalitarian approaches, men and women are both counted in a minyan. And then I would say in the Reform world, it's not so strict. If you have fewer than 10 showing up, you might have a prayer service anyway, depending on the flexibility of the rabbi.
Well, Rabbi,
Yes.
I tell you personal experience. I turned 60 when I decided to have my bar mitzvah because I couldn't have it during the war or after the Russians. And S. Chaim didn't want to give me the opportunity because I didn't want to do it during a big temple service. And I was very fortunate that when I came to Erat Elohim, only Cantor David said, okay, you can come in, let's say Thursday afternoon with your family and do the Torah reading. Otherwise, they didn't, conservative synagogue or Orthodox synagogue didn't want to let me read from the Torah alone.
Yeah, so my guess is the objection was that you wanted to read without a minyan.
Yes.
Okay, yes.
Only my family was there.
Right. So that would be the objection.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is, and I often say this sometimes to the surprise of individuals, that if you're male and you're over 13, or if you're female and you're Jewish, if you're male, you're Jewish and you're over 13, female, Jewish, and over 12, you are bar or bat mitzvah. You don't need to have any kind of ceremony to celebrate it. It's kind of like reaching the drinking age. Once you're 21, let's say in this state, in California, you are eligible to drink. You don't actually have to go out and drink to be eligible to drink, but you can celebrate it by going to a bar and having a drink. So what is the celebration? The celebration of a bar mitzvah is where the 13-year-old child or the 16-year-old, 60-year-old adult does something that only an adult Jew is allowed to do under Jewish law. And in the case you're describing, what you wanted to do is read Torah on behalf of a congregation. Okay. What I often hear of all the time is someone who has never been bar mitzvah. They somehow connect with Chabad, and Chabad will put tefillin on them and lead them through the prayer of putting tefillin on, and they will be told, this is your bar mitzvah. And it's true that for only an adult Jew says the blessings and puts on tefillin to comply with Jewish law. So, and for women, it would be lighting Shabbat candles and so on. Okay, sorry for the diversion, but that's what I do. So I think we're here. Oh, and they pointed out that they're sort of reproducing this idea of the theophany meaning the meeting of God, the appearance of God to the congregation, which forms the basis of the covenant with Israel. And that's certainly at the heart of Judaism, is this idea at Sinai, the Israelites, to be precise, not the Jews, the Israelites entered into a covenant with God. Okay, so Jerry, if you want to continue, we can continue reading here at Deuteronomy reiterates.
Deuteronomy reiterates the importance of reading to children. Yes, reading to children. Their children too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere Yahweh, your God, as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross the Jordan and possess.
Okay, and they say who have not had the experience. The Hebrew is not quite that specific. Lo yodea, lo yad'u. that don't know. And they shall hear, Yishma'u. But the issue there is also something which we discuss from time to time. V'lamdu v'yira, so that they will learn to be in yira. And as we often discuss, I always think of yira as being 2/3 awe, 1/3 fear. And we have a lot of discussion about what does it mean to fear God and is it appropriate to fear God. Okay, why don't you finish up this section, Jerry?
In this ceremony, all the Israelites must gather to hear the Torah read aloud, even women and young children, making this passage the earliest
Instantation. I love the vocabulary in these texts.
instantation.
I would have used the word instance, but
Yeah, okay.
I don't have a PhD, so.
In the ancient Near East of the innovative.
By the way, pardon me, but it is instantiation.
Oh, thank
To
you.
ins-
Thank you.
To instantiate is to take something abstract and make it real.
Right.
Ah, okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's a very important difference. And
Yes.
yes, thank you. And improving our vocabulary. Instantiation. Yes.
Yes, and the innovative idea of setting a specific time for inclusive religious public education.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Bryce. That's a really important distinction. Okay. Would someone else like to pick up at the next section?
By the way,
Thank you. Nope. Sorry, was that a no way? Somebody else? Anybody?
I can read if you want.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine. Sure. Deuteronomy's covenant ceremony and ANE vassal treaties.
Ancient Near East vassal treaty.
Okay.
Thank you.
The Hakel ceremony at the end of Deuteronomy functions to renew the covenant between God and Israel. Since the 1950s, biblical scholarship has compared this covenantal idea and institution with the genre of political treaties and oaths from the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE found throughout the ancient Near East.
Okay, so again, millennia is 1,000 years. So this is like from the year 2000 BCE, before the Common Era, just to kind of orient our time frame. Oops. Okay.
Some of these treaties were between equals of political rank, others between suzerain and vassal, demanding loyalty to the overlord from the inferior party. The latter type, from the 2nd and 1st millennia, have a number of key features, many of which overlap with Deuteronomy. Historic prologue, a list of the favors bestowed by the suzerain on the vassal, which was prevalent in the 2nd millennium Hittite treaties.
And everybody, I hope understand, the suzerain is sort of the ruling authority.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Obligations, a list of political and military obligations imposed upon the vassal. Divine witnesses, a list of the gods of both co-signatories were called upon to witness the treaty. Do they ever testify? Well, whatever. There we go. Curses. The vassal treaties had varied curse formulae recited and sometimes acted out in order to ensure the vassal's loyalty. Oaths. The earlier treaties were solemnized by a sworn oath of allegiance by the life of the gods, i.e. Nis Ili.
Yeah, and I have no idea what that is. I often when they do that, they're doing Hebrew, but I don't recognize it as Hebrew. Anyway, I have no idea what's meant by that. If anybody does, you can chime in.
No, maybe Cheryl will look it up.
That's what I'm doing right now.
There you go. Needless to say, parallels to these paragraphs have been found in the Torah, especially in the book of Deuteronomy.
I'm going to scroll up a bit.
Treaty in a box by the deity. Of particular interest is the clause assuring the safekeeping of these vassal treaties placed in a box, Aron. That's an accent mark. I don't know how to make
Yeah,
sense of.
I think it indicates that the first letter is either an aleph or an ayin, uh, a way of saying, but Aaron is the
Aron.
ark. It means ark.
Okay, okay, all right. So
The
ark is really just box, but we've made it a specialized word. Okay.
yes, and by Aaron, I mean the ark that's in the synagogue, not
Yes.
Noah's ark. I
No,
don't
no,
know
I
that. Yeah,
totally get it. Because yes, where else, why would you put your treaties in a boat?
right.
Anyway, so
Read aloud before the king.
image of the D. Okay, right. Read aloud before the king. The text was to be read aloud before the vassal king and his court at selected intervals that could range from every couple of months to several years. This recital of the text reiterated the vassal's duties as well as the favors that the sovereign had benevolently granted him. See, for example, the treaty between Muwatalli II of Hatti, I guess circa 1300, and Alexandru of Wilusa, Ilios, Troy.
And I have no idea what those are.
Well, those are, cool treaties.
Yes.
So furthermore, this tablet, which I
Kingdoms.
have made for you, Alexandru, shall be read out before you 3 times yearly, and you, Alexandru, shall know it.
Okay, I can't resist going down to footnote number 7 to see if there's any more information there. Nope. Hittite. Okay, so it's Hittite. Diplomatic text. Now the trick is going to be to find where we were. Okay, there we
Well,
were.
they were pretty legalistic folks.
Yeah, and I wonder, Jerry Kirschman, if this is the kind of thing you're thinking of when you say that this sort of practice occurred. Now they're not quoting Egyptian sources.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it was very common. Unfortunately, we think a lot of what we did was original. It's not necessarily original. Our interpretation was very different, but it was not original. It was a big world.
Yeah,
And
the idea of a covenant, of a treaty between a
Right.
greater power and a lesser power that we have in Torah, and in this case Deuteronomy, is very much along the lines of what we see historically in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, not only the form of it, but even the structure of the document, that this
Yeah.
is what happens when, if everything's great. And if you don't do that, then this is all the punishments that are going to be meted out to you.
Yep.
That's very common. They mentioned Hittite or Mitanni, or, obviously Asher, etc. They were all very common the way they did this. And so they would typically make a deal with a city or conquer it. Then they'd make an arrangement, and they didn't have these annual readings or whatever it was, that so everybody can hear what it is that they were supposed to do. Of course, if you fast forward that to Ezra's time and points that you pointed out to, Hasmonean era, they did that, and there was other reasons that they wanted to ensure compliance, but that's what it was all about, is ensuring compliance to make sure people were doing what they were supposed to be doing, and paying their fees, etc., whatever is back to the masters.
Okay. Bryce, why don't you continue?
This last feature is particularly significant in our context, since it is likely that the public reading of the Torah was envisioned along these same lines. In the Torah, however, the vassal treaty has been recast from a political document with local and limited time-bound import, which was frequently broken into a sublime, divinely revealed text that has shaped Israel's destiny and theology over the millennia.
One of the things, I think about this a lot, that the nature of the relationship between Israel and Israel's God, as envisioned in these biblical texts, is covenantal. Namely, there's mutual obligations. It's not all, the God dictates the rules and all we can do is comply, but God also has obligations. And I always think of the best example of that is in the story of Abraham arguing the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, where he challenges God, saying, shall not the God of justice act justly? And basically challenges God that what God's about to do violates, in a sense, that's this idea of covenant, that God has to act justly, in accordance with God's own sense of justice. Whereas if you look at the mythology, Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, the gods are always raping and stealing and playing games and lying and cheating, and I mean, they make for really good stories. But there's no sense of the gods being bound to some sort of higher sense of justice. Okay.
That's quite a tool, by the way. That really is quite a tool.
And by
Well, what I mean is to be able to, in a sense, enter into a covenant that binds God.
yes.
That is a remarkable thing, I think, in history. I don't know, Jerry. I don't know if Jerry's hiding, but what I'm wondering is, has anyone else done this prior to actually enter into a covenant that binds a God to something, using the God's own sense of justice to prevent them from acting unjustly?
Yeah, but with one major exception, through an intermediary. Right. So, if it was the king of Asher, then it was the king of Asher who was in between you and that God, right?
Okay.
But the Hebrews did it different. It was direct representation, and that was absolutely unique.
So actually,
as far as
I don't understand the intermediary in this case. So who would call the king of Asher, I'm sorry, the god of Asher, to act responsibly? Would it be only the king?
Well, it would be the high priest,
Uh-huh.
right? And it depends on when. So if you go way back when, it was originally the high priest, who was a separate lineage, and the high priest and his sons would be, sound familiar, would be the the people that were the only ones that were allowed inside. They literally called it the Holy of Holies. The same thing in Egypt. Egypt had a Holy of Holies, and only the priest could go in there. But then, so for example, in many Mesopotamian cities later on, the king decided he was also the high priest.
The king decided who is?
He's also the high priest. Yeah.
Yes.
So be like, why have half power when you can have it all? So there was some of that happened later on. If coming back to Egypt, which is interesting because Egypt structurally is more parallelisms to definitely the temple, and then Judaism, it's especially its origins. So they had their Holy of Holies. Only the priest was allowed in there. They had a ceremony to go in, what they wore, what they washed, and etc. And they would carry a box like the ark from one place to another. And by the way, when they were carrying that, if it moved a certain direction, that was indicative of the God's will, what they wanted, which is why that if somebody accidentally dropped it, it would be considered you're taking the word for the God for yourself. But anyway, so but what I meant backing up a little bit is that what the difference is the Hebrews who said, well, the king is also responsible to God, right, as much as anyone else. That was different, right? So the king, especially if you look at, king was supposed to know the scroll, right? Was supposed to learn the scroll and read the scroll and all that. That was different, and that made people think, well, look, the king's responsible for the same laws that I'm responsible for. That's a kind of a really good thing. That was different.
And I think the idea that Bryce is responding to is the same one I'm responding to, is that God is responsible and God is bound by something, rather than having complete free will, which I find, to be an enormous innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were other cultures that had something similar to that, but like you're saying, but that binding was via a proxy, so it was a little different.
Okay, and just to comment on this idea of Egyptian, temples and Holy of Holies, I had the pleasure and the amazing experience of taking a cruise up the Nile, and the boat would stop at sites where there were temples, and the temples in some cases are in pretty good states of restoration. And boy, we saw exactly this, the closest I've ever had to a sense of what the temple might have been like is going into
exactly.
one of these Egyptian temples and working your way into the center. And it's pretty powerful. Yeah, thank you. Erwin.
I would like to ask you that why the God has to reinforce the covenant with different characters in the Torah. And also, I think every time you put on the tefillin in the morning, you reinforces the covenant. And every male Jewish child who is born and circumcised reinforces the covenant.
Well, so what I would say is, in the biblical story, different elements of the covenant are revealed at different times. So between God and Abraham, it's very simple. Basically, God says to Abraham, I will be your God and your family will be my people. And I will give you the land and your offspring will be numerous and the nations of the world will be blessed through your family.
But he has
And
to
yeah,
be circumcised.
and then yes, and then what does Abraham have to do? First of all, he has to leave his homeland, his house, and travel where God to a place that God will show Abraham, and he has to circumcise himself. And
Yeah.
since that moment, the tradition is that Jews, let me put it this way, Israelites and now Jews, accordance with the Bible, circumcise themselves or are circumcised at age 8 days. And it's always astounded me that the Reform movement didn't get rid of this. And, you know, I think of all the things that we got rid of as being sort of ancient ceremonies that no longer speak to us. I'm not aware of, I mean, I think there have been individuals in the Jewish world and in the Reformed Jewish world that have, you know, tried to move away from circumcision, but I'm not aware of that ever being a serious movement within Judaism. And I don't know any Reform rabbi who looks down on circumcision. There are Reform rabbis who will not insist on babies being circumcised. And a big issue is in conversion. If the person is not circumcised, in traditional Judaism, they must be circumcised. And I know many Reform rabbis, yours truly included, who would not insist upon that. But I don't know any Reform rabbis who look down on the idea of circumcision being barbaric or outmoded, in the same way that these same rabbis might look down on keeping strictly kosher or putting on tefillin or praying 3 times a day as being sort of an outmoded custom that no longer speaks to us. I think rather than jumping into the next section, I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, Erwin has his hand up.
Yeah. Erwin, do you still have your hand up? Or
No,
okay.
I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so it's 8 o'clock, and I think I'm not going to jump into the next section. It's a longish article, and we can continue reading it and discussing it next time. Jim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, the thing was, your header was, you know, the first public Torah reading, but it appears that we're only talking about Deuteronomy. Is that correct?
Yes, so I would say that was a comment that was included, that the scholars believe that in Deuteronomy, they were only talking about Deuteronomy. I would say traditional Judaism would say that that really refers to Torah. And now, you know, and I think the remainder of the article is going to get more specific. But yeah, there's always this question, which I'm always hovering between, is what do scholars say and what does the religious tradition say? And I always feel an obligation to kind of cover both. I'm trying to remember who is the author here. Let's see, Torah.com, Aaron Dembski. And usually at the end, we'll see who he is.
He's from Bar-Ilan University.
Yep. Okay. There. Well, you can't see it, but yeah, a professor emeritus of biblical history at Bar-Ilan. So he's not a rabbi. So you would expect his analysis to be more scholarly than than pious or religious.
Because we're next time we're going to jump into, is it where Josiah discovers this scroll and rends his garments? And
Yes, we're going to get in. I believe
that
this
was the
article
first
gets
reading of Torah when Josiah did that? The first public reading?
well, so the Bible records. No, the Bible records Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's after Josiah. Josiah is several hundred years earlier.
Right.
So yeah, so what scholars would say is, if I remember, the sum and substance of this article, is that the book of Deuteronomy, which we traditionally is accounted to be one of the 5 books of Moses and given to Moses on Mount Sinai, scholars believe that this was a book that was either written or discovered during the reign of King Josiah, and it is a reform of Judaism. Some scholars would call this the first Reform Judaism. So, for example, rather than everyone having their own little altar, particularly at Passover, and slaughtering your own Paschal lamb and celebrating in your own house, the book of Deuteronomy shifts everything to be done at a place where God will cause his name to dwell, which, if you read it in the scholarly sense, this is Jerusalem, where King Josiah is reigning, and what he's trying to do is consolidate power and consolidate the not only the political system but also the religious system in Jerusalem. And part of that would be this public reading of either Deuteronomy or entire Torah. Bryce.
Yeah, I would assert that concentrating the power into Jerusalem, into a single giant temple, made Judaism extremely vulnerable. All right, when worship was distributed all around, there was no central point to break Judaism. Okay?
It's a very interesting idea. And I don't disagree with it. And of course, what happened was, had we stuck with this idea of sacrifice at only one place in the world, Judaism would have disappeared with the destruction of the temple in the year 70.
Mm-hmm.
But according to Jewish tradition, God gave a second set of instructions, a second Torah, an oral Torah to Moses on Sinai, which, sometimes I think of break glass in case of fire, study these sections in case the temple's destroyed, where the role of animal sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem is replaced by prayer in synagogues. And, so far, about 2,000 years later, it seems to be working. Erwin.
If I agree with Bryce that when Peter built the church in Rome, did the church become more vulnerable because it was concentrated in one place?
Yeah,
There was one issue, Erwin, is there was a whole lot more Romans, and they were a far bigger military power. All right, so it took quite a while to make Rome vulnerable, but
yeah, and worship, I don't think was limited to the church
no,
in
it
Rome.
wasn't. They were all over the place.
There were churches all over the place, which really,
temples, really.
Yeah, well,
to the gods. They had temples to gods everywhere and oracles and everything.
Yeah,
well,
I'm thinking of Christianity.
Yeah.
There were Christian churches in the early days of Christianity all over the place. Certainly many in Jerusalem, and we find them in Nazareth and all throughout the Holy Land, and we find them throughout the the place where all these letters of Paul are being written to and from. So it sounds like what the early church did was very similar to what the Jews were doing in terms of synagogues as places for gathering and prayer, and not needing to be at one central location. Jerry.
Yeah, and back to your point, and Jim, I think you're getting to something, although maybe that's for next week. But it's an interesting point. Why? I hope the article, I haven't read ahead, I try not to. I hope we get into the why of it, right?
The
why you would do
why
these things.
Josiah did it?
No, why do public Torah readings?
Oh,
Yeah. So
Yeah,
if we're gonna get
yeah.
into that, then we'll hold off and talk about it then next
yeah,
week.
I'm not 100% sure, but we'll see.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all. If there's no other comments, so we
Yeah.
will relax for the evening, and I will grab the ice pack.
Grab the ice pack and
Yes.
take it easy and heal up, and
Yep.
we'll see you,
Yep.
Wednesday?
Yes,
How
Wednesday.
are you feeling?
Well, let me